Chapter 13 of the Book of This and That. On Coincidences. An amazing story of coincidences appears in the Westminster Gazette. During the Boer War 4 men met by chance for the first time on the eve of some big action, and the meeting was so agreeable that one of the men who had a bad 2-shilling piece in his pocket divided it, and gave each of the others a quarter as a memento of the evening. Immediately afterwards they separated, and never saw or heard of each other again till a few evenings ago, when a dinner was given in honour of somebody or other in Birmingham. The 4 men were friends of the guest of the evening, and all of them turned up at the dinner, where they recognized each other easily, we are told, because each of them was wearing his quarter florin on his watch chain. Life is, of course, a series of coincidences, but we never cease to be surprised as each new one happens, and nothing can destroy their recurring freshness. We may make mathematical calculations showing that there is a chance in a million that such and such a thing will happen, but, when it happens once in a million times, it seems to us as marvelous as a comet. We cannot get accustomed to the pattern of nature, which repeats itself as daringly as the pattern in a wallpaper. Our fathers recognized this pattern, and saw in it the weird craftsmanship of destiny. We who believe in iron law, which surely applies a rigid pattern, are by a curious want of logic skeptics, and we treat each new emergence of the pattern as a strange exception to scientific rule. We cannot believe that nature arranged howlings of dogs and disasters in the stars to accompany the death of a Caesar or a Napoleon. Everything that we can call dramatic in nature we put down to chance and coincidence. Superstitious people confront us with instance upon instance of the succession of omen and event, but we label these exception number 1, exception number 2, and so forth, and go cheerfully on our way. Believers in omens tell us that, some time before Lynd's trial and execution, he found his portrait fallen on the floor, and predicted disaster, and they ask us to admit that this was more than a coincidence, especially as there are 100 similar stories. They relate how the stumble of a horse proved as fatal an omen for Mungo Park as did the fall of a pitcher for Lynd. One day before he departed on his last expedition to Africa his horse stumbled, and Sir Walter Scott, who was with him, said, "I am afraid this is a bad omen." "Omens follow those who look to them," replied the explorer, and set forth on the expedition from which he never returned. Luckily we have examples which suggest that Park, and not Scott, was right. Everyone knows the story of William the Conqueror's fall as he landed on the shores of England, and how, in order to calm the superstitious alarm of his followers, he called on them to observe how he had taken possession of the country with both hands. In the very fact of doing so, of course, he merely substituted one interpretation of an omen for another. But if omens are capable in this way of opposite interpretations, we are on the direct road to skepticism about their significance, and so to a view that most events that appear to have been heralded by omens are simple coincidences. One remarkable coincidence of this kind came to my ears the other day. A man I know was suddenly dismissed from his post with 3 months' salary in his pocket. I happened to be talking about superstitions with him the same afternoon, when he said, "It's all very well, but only last week, when I was in the country, some one was telling fortunes by tea leaves in the house where I was stopping, and he turned to me and said, 'Old man, there's a big surprise in store for you, and I see some money in the bottom of the cup. I shan't let them know this has happened,' he added, as it might encourage them to be superstitious." Certainly, when such a coincidence happens in our own lives, it is difficult to believe that it is not a deliberate act on the part of nature. Nature, we can see, does concern herself with the minutest cell or atom of our being, why not with these premonitory shadows of our deeds and sufferings? Many coincidences, on the other hand, admit of a less fatalistic explanation. Everybody has noticed how one no sooner meets a new name in a book that one comes on the same name in real life also for the first time. I had not read Mr. Forrest Reed's novel, The Bracknells, a week, when, on walking down a London avenue, the same name, The Bracknells, stared at me from a gate. It is not easy, however, to conceive that destiny deliberately leads one into a suburban avenue to enjoy the humor of one's surprise at so trivial a coincidence. It is a more natural conclusion that these names one begins to notice so livelily would still have remained unobserved, were it not that they had acquired a new significance for one's eyes, owing to something one had read or heard. After all, one can ride down the Strand on the top of a bus for a month without consciously seeing a single name over a shop window. But let any of these names become real to us as the result of some accident, and it leaps to one's eyes like a scene in a play. It is merely that one now selects this particular name for observation, and ignores the others. It is all due to the artistic craving for patterns. I am inclined at times to explain the evidence in favor of the Baconian theory of Shakespeare as pattern mongering. Those ciphers, those coincidences of phrase and suggestion at such and such a line from the beginning or end of so many of the plays, those recurrences of hoggish pictures, are enough to shake the balance of anyone who cannot himself go forward with a study of the whole evidence. But, as we proceed with an examination of the coincidences, we find that many of them are coincidences only for the credulous. It seems a strange coincidence that Shakespeare and Bacon should so often make use of the same metaphors and words, but it seems strange only till we discover that plenty of other pre-Shakespearean and Elizabethan writers made use of them as well. Much of the Baconian theory, indeed, is built, not upon coincidence, but upon pseudo-coincidence. The fact that Shakespeare died on the same day of the month, or almost on the same day, as that on which he was born is really a more interesting coincidence than any that occurs within the field of Baconianism. Much the same may be said of the coincidences discovered by those who have, at one time or another, counted up the numerical values of the letters in the names of Napoleon and Gladstone and other leaders of men, and found that they were equal to 666, the fatal number of the Antichrist. In nearly every case the name has been distorted in its transliteration into Greek in such a way as to make the coincidence no coincidence at all. On the other hand, there are some genuinely interesting coincidences in figures, which have been recorded by various writers on credulity and superstition. French history, since the middle of the 18th century, can almost be written as a series of figure-mongers' coincidences. It began with Louis XVI, who came to the throne in 1774. By adding the sum of the ciphers in this figure to the figure itself, 1774 plus 1 plus 7 plus 7 plus 4. The arithmetical diviners point out that you get 1793, the year of the king's death. Similarly, the beginning of the French Revolution foretold the end of the revolutionary period with Napoleon's fall, for if you add up 1789 plus 1 plus 7 plus 8 plus 9, you get 1814, the year of Elba. Louis Philippe's accession date, 1830, gives scarcely less remarkable results. If you add to it the figures in 1773, the date of his birth, 1830, plus 1 plus 7 plus 7 plus 3, you get 1848, the date of his fall and flight. It is the same if you add to his accession date the figures in 1809, the date of his marriage, Here again 1830 plus 1 plus 8 plus 0 plus 9 results in 1848. And if you turn to his queen you find that the figures in her birth date, 1782, lead up to the same fatal message. 1830 plus 1 plus 7 plus 8 plus 2 once more mount to the ominous figure. The arithmeticians, whose ingenuities are recorded in Mr. Sharper Knowlson's Origins of Popular Superstitions, have unearthed similar significances in the dates of Napoleon III. They add the figure 1852, the date of his inauguration as emperor, to the ciphers of 1808, his birth date, 1852 plus 1 plus 8 plus 0 plus 8, and arrive at the fatal date, 1869, when the empire came to an end. The Empress Eugenie was born in 1826 and married in 1853, and the ciphers in these dates to 1852. 1852 plus 1 plus 8 plus 5 plus 3, or plus 1 plus 8 plus 2 plus 6, and 1869 appears once more. But there is no need to go on with these quaint sums. I have quoted enough to suggest the intricate and subtle patterns which the ingenious can discover everywhere in nature. Nature, assuredly, has provided us with coincidences so lavishly that we may well go about in amazement. Even the fiction of Mr. William Le Queux is not quite so abundant in strange coincidences as the life of the most ordinary man you could see reading a halfpenny newspaper. It is only in literature, indeed, that coincidences seem unnatural. Sophocles has been blamed for making a tragedy out of a man who unwittingly slew his father and afterwards unwittingly married his mother. It is incredible as fiction, but I imagine real life could give us as startling a coincidence even as that. Each of us is, to use Sir Thomas Browne's phrase, Africa and its prodigies. We tread a miraculous earth which is all mirrors and echoes, hints and symbols and correspondences. Each deed we do may, for all we know, be echoed and mirrored in nature in 1,000 places, even before we do it, and I can imagine it possible that the shape of a man's fate may be scattered over the palm of his hand. I am a skeptic on the subject, and I see what a door is open to charlatanry if we admit the presence of too many meanings in the world about us. But I am not ready to deride the notion that there may be some undiscovered law underlying many of the coincidences which puzzle us. True, if someone contended that a mysterious sort of gravitation was working steadily through the years to bring those four soldiers together again at the Birmingham dinner, I should be anxious to hear his proofs, but I am willing to listen patiently to almost any theory on the subject. No theory could be more sensational than the facts. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of the book of This and That. On indignation. There is nothing in which the newspapers deal more generously than indignation. There is enough indignation going to waste in the columns of the London press to overturn the pyramids in ruins and to alter the course of the Danube. We have had a characteristic flow of popular indignation over the execution of Mr. Benton, a British citizen, in Mexico. Probably not one Englishman in a million had ever heard of Mr. Benton before, but no sooner was he executed and in his grave than he rose, as it were, the very impersonation of British citizenship outraged by foreigners. On the whole, there is nothing healthier than group indignation of the kind that sees in an injury to one an injury to all, that demands just dealing for even the poorest and least distinguished member of the group. It is the sort of passion it would be pleasant to see trained and developed. My only complaint against it is that in the present state of the world it is too often reserved for foreigners and for those semi-foreigners, the people who belong to a different political party or social class from your own. One would have thought, for instance, that the group indignation which denounced the execution of Mr. Benton without a fair trial might also have denounced the expulsion of the labor leaders from South Africa with no trial at all. The fact that it did not, and that several of the London capitalist papers treated the whole South African episode as a good joke at the expense of labor is evidence that to a good many Englishmen the maltreatment of British citizens is not in itself an objectionable thing, provided it happens within the British Empire. It seems to me that this is an entirely topsy-turvy kind of patriotism. For every British citizen who is likely to be badly treated abroad, there must be thousands who are in danger of being badly treated in the British Empire itself. Is not the killing of an Englishman by an English railway company, for instance, as outrageous a crime as the killing of an Englishman by a foreign general? There is also this to be remembered. Your indignation against the criminal in your own country is more likely to bear fruit than your indignation against the criminal in a foreign country. You can catch your English railway director with a single policeman. You may not be able to catch your foreigner without an international war. Thus, though I do not question the occasional value of indignation against wicked foreigners, I contend that a true economy of indignation would lead to most of its being directed against wicked fellow countrymen. It may be retorted that Englishmen certainly do not limit their indignation to foreigners, and that the Marconi campaign is a proof that a good Englishman can always become righteously indignant against a bad Englishman, at least when the latter happens to be a Welshman or a Jew. But the Marconi campaign was only another example of group indignation against persons who were outside the group. It was not, in this instance, a national or imperial group. It was a party group. What I am arguing for is the direction of group indignation, not against outsiders, but when necessary against the members of the group. I should like to see conservatives becoming really indignant about conservative scandals, liberals becoming really indignant about liberal scandals, socialists becoming really indignant about socialist scandals. As it is, indignation is usually merely a form of sectarian excitement. It is always easy to find something about which to become indignant in your political opponent, if it is only his good temper. His crime of crimes is that he is your political opponent. You use his minor crimes merely as rods to punish him for that. Our indignation against our opponents, to say truth, is usually ready long before the happy excuse comes which loses it like a wild beast into the arena. One sees a good example of this leashed indignation in the Ulster Unionist attitude to nationalist Ireland. There is a silly scuffle about flags at Castle Dawson between a Sunday school excursion party and a Hibernian procession, both of which ought to have known better. Not a woman or child is injured, according to the verdict of a judge on the bench, but the Ulster Unionists, armed to the teeth with indignation in advance, denounced the affair as though it were on the same level of villainy with the September massacres. Not long afterwards real outrages break out in Belfast, and Catholics and Socialists are kicked and beaten within an inch of their lives. Here was a test of the reality of the indignation against outrages on human beings. Did the Ulster men then come forward in a righteous fury against the wrongdoers on their own side? Not a bit of it. Sir Edward Carson did disown them in the House of Commons, but the Ulster Unionists, as a whole, raised not a breath of indignation. Being average human beings, indeed, they invariably retort to any charges made against them with an angry tu quoque to the South. It is not long, for instance, since a special commission sat to investigate the facts about sweated women workers in Belfast, and issued a report in which the prevalence of sweating was demonstrated beyond the doubt of any but a blind man. Instead, however, of directing their indignation against the evils of a system in their own midst, the Ulster Unionists, at least one of their organs in the press, straightway sent one of their representatives down into the south of Ireland to prove how bad wages and conditions of life were there. What a waste of indignation all this was! Munster was full of indignation against the disease of sweating in Belfast, which it could not cure. Ulster, on the other hand, was full of indignation against the disease of bad housing in Dublin, which it could not cure. There is a flavour of hypocrisy in much of this anger against sins that are outside the circle of one's own responsibility. I do not mind how many sins a man is angry with provided they include the sins he is addicted to himself, and that are at his own door. There is a little credit in a rich manufacturer's indignation against the evils of the land system if he is indifferent to the evils of the factory system. And landlords who denounce industrial evils but see nothing that needs redressing in the lot of the agricultural laborer are in the same boat. Perhaps, in the end, the world is served even by this outside virtue. The landlords, in order to distract attention from their own case, have more than once brought a useful indignation to bear on the case of the manufacturers, and vice versa, and ultimately the bewildered, ox-like public has begun to drink in a little of the truth. On the other hand, this is an unhealthy atmosphere for public virtue. It gives rise to cynical views such as are expressed in the proverb, "When thieves fall out, honest men come by their own," and in the lines concerning those who compound for sins they are inclined to by damning those they have no mind to. We all do it, unfortunately. The Presbyterian speaks with horror of the way in which the Catholic breaks the Sabbath, and the Catholic thinks it a terrible thing that the Presbyterian should go to a theatre on Good Friday. Montaigne, who was by inclination a sensualist, looked with disgust on the man who drank too much, and the drunkard retorts that every vice except his own is selfish and antisocial. Even when we admit our own sins we are half in love with them. It seems a less intolerable crime in oneself to rob the poor box than in one's neighbour to have an unwashed neck. Englishmen never began to sing the praises of cleanliness as the virtue that makes a nation great until they had themselves taken to the bath. True, they often washed, as they governed themselves, not directly but by proxy. But even so, cleanliness has been exalted into a national virtue till the very people of the slums, where the bath is used only for the storage of coal, have learned to shout "dirty foreigner" as the most indignant thing that can be said at a crisis. There is nothing that makes us feel so good as the idea that some one else is an evildoer. Our scandal about our neighbours is nearly all a muttered tribute to our own virtue. It fills us with a new pride in ourselves that it was not we who gambled with trust money or made love to our neighbour's wife or ran away in battle. By kicking our neighbours down for their sins we secure for ourselves, it seems, a better place on the ladder. The object of all religion is to destroy this self-satisfied indignation with our neighbours, to make us feel that we ourselves are no better than the prostitute or the foreigner. Similarly, philosophy bids us know ourselves instead of following the line of least resistance and damning others. That is why one would like to see Englishmen concerned about injuries done to Englishmen by Englishmen, even more than about injuries done to Englishmen by foreigners. Indignation against the latter, necessary though it may be, is apt to become a mere melodramatic substitute for native virtue. There are crimes enough at home for any Englishman to practise his indignation upon without ever letting his eye wander further than Dover. Crimes of underpayment, crimes of overwork, crimes of rotten houses, crimes that are murder in everything but swiftness and theft in everything except illegality. It is fine, no doubt, that Englishmen should become hot with anger at the news of a Benton murdered in Mexico, as it is fine that the democracies of Europe should be inflamed with indignation at the murder of a Ferrer in Spain. These things are evidence of large brotherhoods, of an extension of those family charities which are at the back of all advance in civilization. On the other hand, Can none of this passionate fraternity be spared for John Smith, age 14, done to death by the half system, or for his father killed on the line as the result of the need of making dividends for railway shareholders, or for his mother working for a halfpenny an hour in a narrow room the filth of which is transmuted into gold for some rich man? These, too, are your brothers and sisters, and deserve the angry eloquence of an epitaph. Here is subject enough for indignation, not a weak and an ineffectual indignation against foreigners, but indignation knocking terribly at your own doors. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of the Book of This and That. The Heart of Mr. Galsworthy. Mr. Galsworthy has been writing to the Times on the heartlessness of Parliament. The Times, always noted for its passion for humane causes, ranges itself behind him and asserts that English men have now learned to speak of the politician with intellectual contempt, as of one who is making a game of realities, who fiddles a dull tune while Rome is burning. Both Mr. Galsworthy and the Times are apparently agreed that the measures which Parliament has for some time past been discussing are matters of trivial significance and, in so far as they take up time which might be devoted to better things, are an outrage upon the conscience of, to use the odd phrase of the newspaper, those who are most interested in the spectacle of life and the future of mankind. Mr. Galsworthy, wearing his heart in his ink-pot, not only denounces the indifference of politicians to vital things, but goes on to lay down an alternative program, a program of the heart, as he might call it, in contrast to the program of the hustings. He begins his list of things which ought to be legislated about with the sweating of women workers and insufficient feeding of children, and he ends it with live instances of, in an even odder phrase than that quoted from the Times, abhorrent things done daily, daily left undone. Export of horses worn out in work for Englishmen, save the mark. Export that for a few pieces of blood money delivers up old and faithful servants to wretchedness. Mutilation of horses by docking, so that they suffer, offend the eye, and are defenceless against the attacks of flies that would drive men, so treated, crazy. Caging of wild things, especially wild songbirds, by those who themselves think liberty the breath of life, the jewel above price. Slaughter for food of millions of creatures every year by obsolete methods that none but the interested defend. Importation of the plumes of ruthlessly slain wild birds, mothers with young in the nest, to decorate our gentle women. Probably 99 readers out of 100 will sympathize with Mr. Galsworthy's bitter cry against a Parliament that has so long left these and other wrongs unrighted. Let Mr. Galsworthy take any one of his cases of inhumanity by itself, and he is sure of the support of nearly all decent people in demanding that an end shall be put to it. The human conscience has developed considerably in recent years in regard to the treatment both of human beings and of animals, and, though conscience is frequently dumb in the impressive presence of economic interests, it has still the power to get things done, as witness, for example, the establishment of minimum wage boards in certain sweated trades. Mr. Galsworthy, however, does not ask you to consider each of his desired reforms on its merits. He asks you, in effect, to put them in place of the reforms which politicians are at present discussing. Almost any one of them, he declares of his brood of evils, is productive of more suffering to innocent and helpless creatures, human or not, and probably of more secret harm to our spiritual life, more damage to human nature, than, for example, the admission or rejection of tariff reform, the disestablishment or preservation of the Welsh Church, I would almost say than the granting or non-granting of Home Rule. It seems to me that Mr. Galsworthy is doing his cause, or causes, no service in making comparisons of this sort. He is like a man who would go before Parliament, when it was discussing some big project like the nationalization of the railways, and deny its right to legislate on such a matter till it had passed a measure forbidding the sticky sort of fly-papers. One might sympathize heartily with his desire to abolish the slow torture of flies, and I for one detest with my whole soul those filthy fly-traps, in which the insects go dragging their legs out till they die. But it is obvious that the question of cruelty to flies is one which must be dealt with on its own merits. To weigh it in the balance against such a thing as nationalization of the railways is merely to invite a humorous rather than a serious treatment of the question. It is not a comic question in itself. It may easily become comic as a result of some ridiculous comparison. That is, more or less, what one feels in regard to Mr. Galsworthy's implied comparison between the importance of free trade and the importance of putting an end to the export of horses worn out in work for Englishmen. Save the mark. Export that for a few pieces of blood money delivers up old and faithful servants to wretchedness. In so far as the export of horses leads to cruelty and wretchedness, I agree with Mr. Galsworthy that it ought to be stopped. Not because the horses are worn out in work for Englishmen, not because they are old and faithful servants, that is mere sentimentalizing and rhetoric, but because they are living creatures which ought not to be subjected to any pain that is not necessary. On the other hand, is not Mr. Galsworthy rather unimaginative in failing to see that tariff reform might conceivably lead in present circumstances to intense pain and distress in every town and county in England? The imposition or non-imposition of a tariff may seem, at a superficial glance, to belong to the mere pedantry of politics. But consider the human consequences of such a thing. Every penny taken out of the pockets of the poor owing to an increase in the price of goods means the disappearance of a potential pennyworth of food from the poor man's home. Obviously, in a country where hundreds of thousands of people are living on the edge of starvation and over it, even a slight raise in the cost of things might produce the most calamitous results. Starvation and disease and the anguish of those who have to watch their children suffer, an increase in crime and insanity and wretchedness, these are all quite conceivable results of a sudden change in the poor man's capacity to buy the necessaries of life. That is the humane free trader's case for free trade. The humane tariff reformer's case for tariff reform, on the other hand, is that a change in the fiscal system would increase wages and employment and quickly put an end to the present abominations of starvation, sweating, and unemployment. I am not concerned for the moment with the comparative merits of free trade and tariff reform. I am concerned merely with pointing out that Mr. Galsworthy's theory that such a thing as the export of worn-out horses causes more suffering to innocent and helpless creatures than would be caused by an error in fiscal policy, affecting millions of men and women and children, does not bear a moment's examination. Take, again, Mr. Galsworthy's comparison of the case of the Home Rule Bill with the case of the caging of wild songbirds. Is not Mr. Galsworthy in this instance also lacking in imagination? Had he read Irish history he would have learned a little about the suffering to innocent and helpless creatures that logically flows from the denial of a country's right to self-government. I will give the classic example. In the late 40s of the 19th century, the Irish potato crop failed. The crops of corn were abundant, cattle were abundant, but the potatoes everywhere rotted in the fields under a mysterious blight. As the potato was the staple food of the people, this would have been sufficiently disastrous, even in a self-governed country. But if Ireland had had self-government in 1847, does anyone believe that her ministers would have allowed corn and cattle to go on being exported from the country while the people were starving? Right through the famine Ireland went on exporting grain and cattle to the value of £17,000,000 a year, so that rents might be paid. Many leading Irishmen urged the government to pass a temporary measure prohibiting the export of foodstuffs from Ireland while the famine lasted. This step had been taken by the governments of Belgium and Portugal in similar circumstances. Had it been taken in Ireland, as it is incredible that it would not if the Union had not been in existence, between 500,000 and 1,000,000 men, women, and children would have been saved from the torture of death by starvation and typhus fever. Not only this, but does not Mr. Galsworthy also overlook those multiplied agonies of exile, eviction, and agrarian crime, which living creatures in Ireland would have been spared, in great measure, at least, if the country had possessed self-government? It may be doubted whether all the wild song-birds that have ever existed since the Garden of Eden have endured among them such an excess of misery as fell to the lot of the Irish people in the half-century following the famine, much of it preventable by a simple change in the machinery of the Constitution. Nor can one easily measure the amount of suffering in England indirectly due to the fact that the political intellect of the country was so occupied with the Irish question that it had not the time or the energy left to tackle scores of pressing English questions. Housing, poor law reform, half-time, these and a host of other matters have been thrust out of the way till statesmen, released from the woes of Ireland, might have time to consider them. Many socialists have a way of forgetting the social meaning of constitutional changes. They regard constitutional reform as something that delays social reform, whereas it may be something that enables the public, if it so desires, to speed up social reform. That is why Home Rule, the abolition of the veto of the House of Lords, and a dozen comparable matters, must be as eagerly ensued by socialists as by radicals. The underfed child, the sweated woman, even the maltreated animal, I imagine, will benefit as a result of changes which, to say the least, take some of the impediments out of the way of the social reformer. Meanwhile, let Mr. Galsworthy and those who think with him redouble their efforts on behalf of humanity, whether towards man or beast. But let them not seek to destroy a good thing that is being done in order to call attention to a good thing that is not being done. Let them not try to persuade us that it is more important for the Russian people to abolish mousetraps than to get a constitutional monarch and sound parliamentary institutions. I have the sincerest respect for Mr. Galsworthy's heart, for the generous passion with which he stands up for all the lame dogs in the world. I agree heartily with every separate cause he advocates in his letter to the Times. It is only his table of values with which I quarrel, and the destructive use he makes of it. I believe that an overwhelming case could be made out against Parliament on the score of its heartlessness, but Mr. Galsworthy has not made it. End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of the Book of This and That. Spring Fashions. In spite of the progress of civilization, there are still women to whom the returning spring is mainly a festival of dresses. It is pleasant to know that there is, after all, a remnant of primitive humanity surviving. Women will before long be the only savages. Long after the last anthropologist has departed from the last South Sea island in despair, when the people have all become Christians and have no manners and customs left, the race of fashionable women will still march its feathered regiments up and down under the sun, a puzzle and an exasperation to the scientific inquirer. Like all really primitive people, women will go on refusing to believe in or bow down to the laws of nature. Nature may tell them, for instance, of the correct position of the human waist, but they will not listen to her. They will insist that the human waist may be anywhere you like between the neck and the knees, according to the fashion of the moment, and nature may as well put her fingers in her ears and go home. Savages, we are told, do not even believe in the manifest generalization of death. They regard each new death as an entirely surprising event, due not to natural but to accidental causes. Similarly, the fashionable woman regards the body each spring as an entirely new body, subject to none of the generalizations which seem appropriate to the body of even a year before. This is the grand proof she offers us of her superiority to the animals. She will have no commerce with the monotony of their ways. She will not submit herself to the regular gait of the sheep, the horse, or the cow, which is the same this year as it was in the year of Waterloo, or for that matter, in the year of Salamis. She claims for her body the liberty to move one year with the long stride of a running fowl, and the next at a hobble like a spancelled goat. It might be said of her that she is not one animal, but all the animals. She will borrow from all nature, dead and alive, indeed, as greedily as a poet. She will color her hair to look like a gorse bush, and her lips to look like a sunset. She will capture the green from the grass, the purple from the hills, the blue from eastern seas, the silver from the mist, as it suits her fancy. One year she will demand of life that it shall be gorgeous in hue as a baboon's courtships. The next, that it shall be as colorless as a rook's funeral. She enters upon the labor of life as though it were a long series of disguises. Probably it was her success in passing from form to form that led the ancient Greeks to suspect the presence of nymphs now in trees, now in running water, and now even in the hills. Everywhere in nature, man sees evasive woman. There is nothing anywhere, from a mountain valley in flower to a chestnut tree glistening into bud, which does not remind him of something about her hats, her cloaks, or her ribbons. Such a plunderer of beauties would, one cannot but feel, become a great artist if only she possessed some standards. But she dresses without standards, without philosophy. There is nothing but appetite in it all, and a capricious appetite at that. She has no settled principle but the principle of change. She flies from grace to ugliness light-heartedly, indiscriminately. She is like the kind of butterfly which you could get only in a fairy tale, a butterfly that could change itself into a mouse, and from a mouse into a dandelion, and from a dandelion into a camel, and from a camel into a grasshopper, and from a grasshopper into a cat, and so on through 1,000 transformations. Her world leaves us giddy like the transformation scene in a pantomime. In her artistic ideals she is a follower, not of Orpheus, but of Proteus. Yet who can disparage her April ritual? She is in league with the whole singing earth, which once a year sets out on its long procession of praise. Her new fashions are but an item in the general rejoicing over the infinite resurrections of nature. Every thorn bush gowns itself in green, a ghost of beauty. Every laurel puts forth new leaves like little green flames. There is a glow in the grass as though some spirit lurked behind it deeper 1,000,000 times than its roots. Everywhere nature has relit the sacred fire. She has given us back warmth, the warmth in which food increases and birds sing. And we can no more escape her gladness than if we had been rescued from the perils and privations of a siege. This is the time when men wake up to find they are alive, and their exultation makes them poets. One of the first things of which man seems to have become conscious in the world about him was the renewal of life each spring. The earth does like a snake renew her winter weeds outworn. Once a year he beheld the coming of the golden age again. He worshipped the serpent as the emblem of endless life long before he learned to suspect it as the devil. He may have been an infidel as he shivered in the winter rains, but the lark leaping into the sun awakened the old splendid credulity again. He knows that Persephone will rise. Hence the divine madness that possesses him year by year at this season, a madness which nowadays expresses itself largely in throwing hard balls at coconuts. Possibly this symbolizes the contemptuous mashing of the winter's fears. For is there anything which looks more like a withered fear than one of those grisly brown bearded fruits? And do not the showman's cries and his bell ringings at the coconut saloon make up a clamor like the clamor of the savage beating forth the flock of his superannuated terrors? He is the incarnation of the boastful faith that has returned to us. Perhaps, too, the coconuts may be symbols of the hoarded food supply of the winter. The supply which we were continually in dread might come to a slow close, and which we can now rail at and insult in our revived confidence in the green world. Certainly this enthusiasm of ours for the spring is not all so disinterested as it appears. We are hungry animals before we are poetical animals, and we are often praising the promise of our food when we seem to be most exalted in our raptures. It may be that even the pleasure we take in the singing of birds is simply a relic of the pleasure which primitive man felt as he heard the voice of many dinners making its way back to him at the turn of the year. But the appeal of music and color need not be so detailedly thematic as that. Man may not have loved the lark's song because he wanted in particular to eat the lark, or indeed any bird. He may have loved it merely as a significant voice amid the chorus and banners of the returning host of eatable things. If it were not so, many of our tastes would be different. Among the smells and colors of spring, those we love most are not the smells and colors of eatable things, but of inculinary things, like roses. And if we loved the music of birds by some standard of the stomach, it is the crowing of the cock, and not the song of the lark, that would inspire us to poetry. It is the grunting of the pig, and not the cuckoo's call, which would startle in us the thrill of romance. There is, on the other hand, just a chance that natural man does respond more sympathetically to the voice of the cock and the pig than to the speech of the cuckoo and the skylark. The difference between the farmer's and the artist's taste in landscape is proverbial. When man looks at the world and sums it up in terms of food, he is indifferent to masses of color and runs of music. His favorite color is the color of a good crop of corn, or a field of grass that will fatten the cattle. He cares less for silver streams than for the drains in his turnip fields. Whether the love of the more ornamental things, the useless songs of the birds, and the scent of flowers, which is a prosaic thing only to the bees, is an advance on this passion for utility may be questioned by the advocates of the simple life. Ornament, they may contend, especially in woman's dress, is simply mannequin's vainglory. Woman was first hung or robed with precious things, not in order that she might be happy, but in order that man might be able to boast of her among his neighbors. She was as sure a sign of his power as a string of enemies' heads hanging from his waist. She was the advertisement of his riches. Before long, woman became happy in her golden slavery. Wisely so, perhaps, for in the end she was able to make use of the man's fatuous love of boasting to exact high terms for aiding him in his conspiracy of magnificence. She studied the science of surprise and applied it to the labor of dressing herself in such a way as to make him slavishly regard her as the most wonderful being on earth. If we may trust the testimony of Mrs. Edith Wharton's novels, woman has so subjugated man with this chameleon brilliance of hers in modern America that he thinks himself quite happy if she makes use of him as the hodman of her charms. Thus, in the spring fashions, we may see the triumph of a sex rather than a hymn of color to the revival of nature. It is a lamentable declension in theory, and therefore I do not entirely believe it. I still hold to the conviction that the gaiety of women's Easter dress is in some manner allied to the gaiety of the earth. It is but a decrepit gaiety compared to what it might be, but that is because of its long association with all sorts of alien things, the necessity of the man-hunt, the pride of the church parade, and the rest of it. When woman meets man on equal terms, she will, one hopes in one's credulous moments, cultivate beauty more and fashion less. She will no longer be estranged from the morning stars that sing together and the little hills that clap their hands. Her feet will be beautiful in Bond Street, and Regent Street shall have cause to shout for joy. End of chapter 16.